June 4, 1942, above the Pacific, 6 American fighters escort a squadron of torpedo bombers suddenly swarmed by 20 Japanese Zeros. The odds are impossible, the technology inferior. Within seconds, one Wildcat falls in flames. Yet when the desperate fight ends, 4 Zeros burn in the sea, and 3 American pilots survive against overwhelming odds. The maneuver that saved them had been invented with matchsticks on a kitchen table. This is the story of the Thach Weave. In the opening months of the Pacific War, American naval aviators faced a crisis of survival. Their primary fighter, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, was outmatched in critical performance categories by the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero climbed faster, with superior rate of climb and acceleration. It turned tighter, with a maneuverability advantage that seemed insurmountable. It was piloted by combat veterans with years of experience over China. The Wildcat, by comparison, was slower in the climb, heavier, less maneuverable. Pilots called it flying with your pockets full of cement. Yet the Wildcat possessed advantages often overlooked in the heat of dogfighting: pilot armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 650 caliber machine guns. The Zero, to achieve its legendary performance, sacrificed protection entirely. No armor, no self-sealing tanks. A single well-placed burst could transform the nimble Zero into a fireball. But in traditional dogfighting, the turn and chase tactics inherited from the First World War, meeting a Zero meant engaging on its terms, and on those terms the Wildcat lost. American formations, still transitioning from the old 3-plane Vic sections to more flexible 2-plane elements, struggled to provide mutual protection. Even the Loughborough Circle, the defensive standard of the previous war, proved useless. The nimble Zero would simply dive inside and pick off targets at will. The performance gap was not merely tactical, it was psychological. The Zero seemed invincible. Among the Navy's fighter squadrons was Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch, commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3, VF3. Thatch was more than a skilled aviator. He was an analytical mind, known for innovations in aerial gunnery and tactical thought. Intelligence reports from 1941 had confirmed what pilots feared. The Zero's extraordinary maneuverability, rate of climb, and acceleration made traditional Allied fighter tactics obsolete. Turn fighting would lead to certain defeat, and Thatch understood something fundamental. You cannot defeat a superior opponent by playing their game. He remembered his days on the football field, on the basketball court. When facing someone faster, you don't try to outrun them. You trap them. You force them into a position where speed becomes a liability. But how do you trap a fighter plane in 3-dimensional combat? Late into the night, in his home in Coronado, California, Thatch worked at his kitchen table. Before him lay a simple tool, matchsticks. Each matchstick represented a fighter. He moved them across the table, simulating attacks, defensive turns, firing angles, over and over, searching for a pattern. Then he saw it. The solution required abandoning doctrine. The Navy had already begun shifting from 3-plane sections to more flexible 2-plane elements in July 1941, a critical foundation for what would come next. Thatch envisioned pairs flying in a wide combat spread, separated by a distance equal to the Wildcat's turning radius. When attacked, the 2 planes would not turn away. They would turn toward each other. The mechanism was elegant. A Zero, committed to attacking one Wildcat from behind, would follow its target through the turn, fixated, aggressive, closing for the kill. But as it crossed the space between the 2 American planes, the second Wildcat would already be turning inward, positioning for a deflection shot at close range. The Zero's aggression would become the trap, its superior maneuverability irrelevant, and its lack of armor and self-sealing tanks fatal. As Thatch later explained, you needed no communication. You were flying along watching the other 2 planes of your combat unit. They suddenly made a turn. You knew there was somebody on your tail, and you had to turn in a hurry. That's all there was to it. He called it the beam defense position. Theory, however, is not reality. Thatch assembled his squadron for a test. 4 defenders would fly F-4F Wildcats with throttles restricted to simulate the Zero's superior speed and climb. 4 attackers, led by Lieutenant Edward O'Hare, one of the squadron's most gifted pilots, would fly unrestricted, simulating the Zero's performance advantage. The attackers dove. Again and again they came, trying every angle, every approach. They could not break through. No matter how aggressively O'Hare's team attacked, the defenders kept weaving into firing positions, crossing paths, trapping the attackers in overlapping fields of fire. When they landed, O'Hare approached Thatch, breathless with excitement. "Skipper," he said, "it really worked. But training is not combat, and combat in June 1942 was coming." On the morning of June 4th, the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance at Midway Atoll. The Japanese had committed their carrier fleet to a decisive engagement, intending to crush the remaining American naval power in a single stroke. Admiral Yamamoto's plan was audacious: lure the American carriers into a trap and destroy them. 3 American carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, stood between Japan and dominance of the Pacific. Their loss would cripple American naval aviation for a year or more. Lieutenant Commander Thatch launched from the USS Yorktown at approximately 0900 hours, leading 6 F-4F-4 Wildcats as escort for VT-3's torpedo squadron. The torpedo bombers, lumbering TBD devastators, slow and defenseless, were flying towards certain contact with the Japanese fleet. Separated from their dive bomber support by clouds and confusion, the formation was dangerously exposed. The sky seemed empty, deceptively calm. Then the Zeros arrived. 15, perhaps 20, an elite combat air patrol from the Japanese carriers diving from altitude with the precision of veteran killers. They had altitude, they had speed, they had numbers. The American formation shattered under the first pass. Within seconds, Ensign Edgar Bassett, flying plane number 4, was shot down by an unseen Zero. He did not survive. Thatch now commanded 5 remaining fighters against 20 Zeros. His division, himself, Ensign Ram Dib, and Lieutenant Brainard Macumber formed the core defensive element. The matchstick theory was about to face its ultimate test. Thatch keyed his radio to Ensign Dib. "Pretend you are a section leader and move out far enough to weave." He used hand signals to communicate with Macumber, whose radio had gone dead. The beam defense position was now in effect. Ensign Dib, flying on Thatch's wing, suddenly found a Zero locked onto his tail. The Japanese pilot closed fast, 300 yards, then 200, lining up for the kill shot. The Zero's twin 20mm cannons and machine guns were already tracking Dib's Wildcat. Dib's voice crackled over the radio, urgent but controlled. "Skipper, there's a Zero on my tail. Get him off." Dib banked hard inward toward Thatch. Maximum deflection. The G-forces pressed him into his seat as the Wildcat groaned through the turn. The Zero followed, fixated, committed to the pursuit. The Japanese pilot had tunnel vision now, locked onto his prey, closing for the certain kill. But as the Zero crossed between the 2 Wildcats, Thatch executed his side of the maneuver, turning sharp and precise toward Dib's oncoming plane. For a brief moment, the Zero was suspended between them, belly exposed, flying perpendicular across Thatch's gun sight. Thatch fired. 650 caliber machine guns converged. The deflection shot tore through the Zero's unprotected belly and wing root at close range, less than 100 yards. Without armor or self-sealing tanks, the fuel ignited instantly. The Japanese fighter burst into flames, pieces tearing away as it rolled inverted and fell toward the ocean below. 1 down, but the attack continued. The remaining Zeros dove again and again, refusing to break off. They had numbers, they had confidence. They pressed their advantage with the aggression that had won them every engagement since Pearl Harbor. Yet something had changed. Each time a Zero committed to a tail chase, the American fighters would cross paths, weaving through each other's flight path with practiced precision. The pursuing Zero would suddenly find itself flying not behind a fleeing target, but between two wildcats turning inward, both bringing guns to bear. Thatch and Lieutenant Brainard Macomber maintained the rhythm. Turn inward, cross, reset, turn again. The weave became a deadly pattern, a trap that reset itself with every attack. The Zeros adapted, trying to attack from different angles, attempting simultaneous runs from multiple vectors. But the fundamental problem remained. To shoot down a wildcat, they had to commit to a pursuit. And every commitment meant flying into the weave's intersection point. The engagement stretched on, 20 minutes of continuous combat. Tracers laced the sky. Aircraft twisted and dove in a three-dimensional ballet of death. The wildcats absorbed hits, the sturdy airframes and self-sealing fuel tanks proving their worth, but kept flying, kept weaving. The Japanese pilots demonstrated a tendency toward individual pursuit rather than coordinated attacks, a tactical weakness that amplified the effectiveness of the beam defense position. Each Zero pilot, furious at seeing his comrades shot down, would commit to his own attack, flying directly into the trap. Another Zero made the mistake of following too aggressively. Macomber caught it with a burst that shredded its vulnerable structure. The Zero, trailing smoke, broke away and spiraled downward. Then another, and another. Thatch himself would be credited with 3 confirmed kills. Dib accounted for 1 more. The Japanese pilots, veterans though they were, had never encountered this tactic. Their training, their experience, their doctrine, all of it assumed that inferior American fighters would try to run or dogfight, but these wildcats weren't running, they were hunting. When the Zeros finally broke off the engagement, pulling up and away to regroup, 4 of their number had fallen burning into the sea. 3 wildcats remained airborne, battered, low on ammunition but alive. Yet survival came at a cost. The desperate fight had left the remaining TBD devastators of VT-3 exposed and unescorted. The Zeros, not engaged with Thatch's division, tore into the torpedo squadron with devastating effect. Most of the torpedo bombers were lost, including their leader, Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. Against impossible odds, the beam defense position had proven its worth. The kitchen table theory had survived contact with reality, but war extracts its price in blood. Thatch brought his battered division back to the Yorktown, landing with fuel tanks nearly empty and ammunition expended. As he climbed from his cockpit, the magnitude of what had just occurred began to settle. He later wrote that it was surprising that any of our pilots returned alive. He credited not the Wildcats' performance, but the tactic itself, and with characteristic modesty, comparatively poor marksmanship of the Japanese. Yet the significance was undeniable. In the crucible of combat, against overwhelming odds, the beam defense position had functioned exactly as designed. Word spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet. Pilots who had considered the Zero invincible now had a proven method of survival. More than survival, a method of victory. The US Navy adopted the tactic immediately. Within weeks, training protocols were rewritten. Another pilot, Commander James Flatley, gave the maneuver a simpler, more memorable name, the Thach Weave. It was taught to every Navy and Marine fighter pilot deploying to the Pacific. Training films were produced, standardizing the technique. Thach himself was pulled from combat operations, his knowledge too valuable to risk, and assigned to train the next generation of aviators. Thousands of pilots would learn the weave from the man who invented it. The weave's impact extended beyond immediate tactical advantage. It proved a fundamental principle that would echo through military aviation for decades. Superior tactics can overcome superior technology. Doctrine, creativity, and disciplined teamwork could defeat raw performance. The tactic transformed fighter combat itself. The romantic notion of the lone ace, dogfighting one-on-one, gave way to disciplined, team-based mutual support. Fighter elements became pairs, not individuals. Wingmen protected each other through coordinated maneuvers. Throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, Marine Corps pilots flying Wildcats from Henderson Field employed the beam defense position with devastating effectiveness, completely confounding the veteran Japanese pilots operating from Rabaul. Over the Solomon Islands and across the Pacific, American fighter pilots used variations of the maneuver. It saved countless lives. It leveled the playing field against the Zero until newer American fighters, the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, arrived with the performance to match Japanese aircraft. The tactic was so effective that it was adopted by the Army Air Corps during World War II and remained fundamental to U.S. Air Force doctrine through Korea and Vietnam. Even then, the underlying principle remained. Modern fighter tactics still emphasize mutual support, coordinated defensive maneuvers, and forcing opponents into disadvantageous firing positions. The Thach Weave's DNA runs through every fighter combat manual written since 1942. Flatley himself called it undoubtedly the greatest contribution to air combat tactics that has been made to date. This strategic decision to pull veteran pilots like Thatch from combat and rotate them into training roles preserved institutional knowledge, directly contributing to the rising skill of American aviators. In contrast, the Japanese Imperial Navy kept its veteran pilots in continuous combat until they were lost to attrition, leading to a steady decline in the experience level of their aircrews by mid-1943. A pattern discovered with matchsticks on a kitchen table in California had rewritten the rules of aerial combat, and in doing so, it had helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing for more deep dives into military history and tactical innovation. Until next time.